Well, hello everybody, wherever you are. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, but not good night as yet. Um, we are on the second session of the seminar on disrupting the status quo, water in health and climate crisis. I don't think anybody will deny that we are in crisis, and the health and climate crisis has crept onto us with frightening speed and staggering scale. So this seminar is trying to devise solutions out of the ordinary to face that. Now there are three sessions, the first of which took place yesterday, was in the storytelling mode, which means that there was no interactive discussion. This particular session, which we are going to have today, is going to be interactive. And this session, yesterday was financing systems and financing system, systemic change. Today is going to be recovery now, disruptive uh, approaches. And tomorrow is going to be a super interactive session. In other words, we're going to have half an hour more for discussions. Disruptive technologies as enabling environments. Okay. You might hear the word disruptive quite often. Disruptive here does not mean destructive. It's very important, quite the opposite, in fact. Disruptive means innovative and imaginative. And perhaps it's unfamiliar because we are on a road less traveled. And so perhaps this word is going to be used in innovative ways, disruptive, but it's certainly not destructive. We're going to come up with solutions and innovations. And to my mind, there are three things, three tests that should be met for it to become, shall I say, innovative in the truest sense of the word. First is the examples and case studies must be of a size and scope proportionate to the problem. In other words, not a garage solution for a universal problem. Second is the, the study or the case study or the approach must address the concerns and issues of vulnerable and poor people. And the third is it must show pathways to scale. Otherwise, we'll have very interesting and innovative solutions, but also isolated ones. Okay, so those are my, yesterday we had a very, very interesting session, actually a conversation between Belinda and Gareth Phillips of the African Development Bank, on, on the difference between adaptive on financial flows to adaptive solutions and mitigation, and bemoaning the fact that the flows to adaptive solutions were very poor and needed to be beefed up. And that could be done by ensuring that the benefits are properly monetized in a way that is consistent and clear to the potential donors. Today we are going to be on another, we're going to, the presenters of the we are going to talk about recovery now, disruptive approaches. How we are going to try and see that the recovery is of is of universal benefit, either in terms of technology or gender or governance or other ways of doing things. This session is going to be moderated by Dr. Arun Shrestha, who's a program manager of ICIMOD. ICIMOD is an 8-country initiative based in Kathmandu, Nepal, and the 8 countries being skirting and in the middle of the Himalayan Hindu Kush chain. The 8 countries being Pakistan and Afghanistan in the west, India and Nepal in the middle, Bangladesh, Bhutan, Myanmar, and China in the east. Now, the Himalayan Hindu Kush range is one of the great water towers of the world. the home to many of the mighty rivers and civilizations of Asia, the source of mighty rivers and civilizations of Asia, and sadly, under immediate and very serious climate change threat. So, Dr. Shrestha is going to take us through this session. So I'm going to turn it over to him. Over to you, Arunji.
Thank you very much, Ravi. And once again, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. I am Arun Shrestha, and I will be taking on from this point as a host of this session. Very nice introduction has been already provided on what we are doing in this seminar through 3 sessions. And in this session, the second in the row, we'll be talking about, some, grounded examples of good practices, which demonstrate the rationale and materiality of urgent interventions. We'll be trying to deal on 3 broad areas. For COVID and recurring climate recoveries, what changes and transformations are needed? I think we'll try to deal on that. Examples of influencing and enabling a transformational recovery, that's something which we will be hear from the experts. And then technologies and solutions having disruptive but positive potential and ways to bring systemic change. Also, we hope to hear from the speakers today. So this is what we are going to do in the remaining time. The way it has been organized, we have 3 presentations from abstract submitters, and these have been selected from many submissions. And then after that, we'll have a panel discussion. Now, from this point onward, I will be speaking very less because we have very little time, and then a lot of exciting thoughts coming up from the presenters and panelists. But before that, I would like to mention that the presentations are all recorded, but the presenters are with us, so you can ask questions to them in the chat box. I'll not give a detailed introduction, but just like to mention that the 3 presentations are from, the first one is from Corinne Schuster Wallace, University of Saskatchewan. The second is from Anna Merotra, Water Environment Federation. And third is from Agnes Nere from SIMAVI. Hopefully I have pronounced the names properly. So these are the presentations lined up. So let's hear the presentations.
Hello, everyone. I'm Corinne Schuster Wallace, Associate Director of Global Water Futures at the University of Saskatchewan. I join you from Saskatoon, Canada, Treaty 6 territory and traditional homeland of the Métis. I'd also like to recognize my co-presenters, Dr. Martina Carretta and Dr. Indrakshi Tandon. The research that we're presenting here is based on a paper developed as part of the UN IPCC 6th Assessment Report of Working Group 2, which focuses on impacts, vulnerability, and adaptation to climate change. Since AR5 not only have the Sustainable Development Goals come into being, but gender has been essentialized in the adaptation literature. And so Working Group 2 was called upon to provide a comprehensive assessment related to how climate change adaptation can be facilitated or hampered by the Sustainable Development Goals. We all know that water insecurity is highly gendered as a result of socially defined roles and responsibilities. And just to be clear, within this context, we're talking about both productive and domestic water uses, because gender roles are associated with, for example, WASH and agricultural activities. WASH has been defined as a low regrets adaptation measure as well. And so in and of itself is considered part of climate adaptation strategies. So the other part of this is that water-related climate adaptation strategies in and of themselves often fail to include a gender lens. And so the goal really was to assess climate change adaptation literature through the lens of both water security, so SDG 6, and gender equity, SDG 5, with a real focus on urban and peri-urban contexts. We undertook a rapid review of peer-reviewed literature between 2014 and 2020, focused on urban and peri-urban water security. And as you can see here, the first take-home message from this summary of the literature and how it mapped on to water security elements, but also the SDG 5 targets, is that there's a gap in evidence for many of the SDG 5 indicators. And the second take-home message here is that many of the linkages are based on fragile, highly localized data. The findings further indicate that there's a lack of literature from the Americas, and there's an overall lack of literature. That the review is based on 33 out of almost 1,000 articles that were screened, and it really indicates that urban water-related adaptation strategies examined in the peer-reviewed literature really often fail to include a gender lens. And in many cases, this reflects a lack of women in decision-making roles. And for example, some of the articles looked at early warning systems and the fact that they aren't designed to reach women in the spaces that they occupy through mediums that they have access to. WASH, menstrual hygiene management, and safety considerations aren't being taken into account in evacuation shelters. And so either women choose not to go to the evacuation shelters, or when they go, they are exposed to issues that they shouldn't have to face. And so in terms of today and this session and disrupting the status quo, really, we believe that the evidence and practice gaps between water-related climate adaptation and gender equity need to be addressed for 4 key reasons. The first is that, again, as we know, access to WASH confers benefits to women. Some examples include improved physical and mental health, reduced labor burdens, reduced risk of domestic and sexual violence, and empowerment. We also know that adaptation strategies that don't consider gendered needs can result in negative impacts on women. What we may not be as aware of is the fact that adapting behaviors on a short-term basis, also some of the coping strategies that come from the ground up, really can become maladaptive to women and young girls. For example, traveling further to fetch water, preparing and consuming less food to conserve water, or reducing water use for personal hygiene, for example. The sort of third take home is that water-related climate adaptation can perpetuate gender burdens. And it makes this crucial that climate change adaptation is envisioned from a gender perspective, while also recognizing that women are not a homogeneous group in and of themselves. Intersectionality, the compounding effect of identities such as socioeconomic status, age, and ability on privilege, are important to understand for us to really be able to recognize and ensure that the most marginalized are able to access adaptation strategies and solutions. And it's really important to note that none of the literature assessed spoke to intersectionality. So ultimately, this study underscores our knowledge that SDG 5 and SDG 6 are interconnected, but also that there are significant opportunities, and I would argue responsibilities, for the water and wash sector to take on both climate and gender mainstreaming simultaneously as we move forward. So in terms of key learnings and recommendations that we'd like to leave with you, the first is that in the absence of formal gender mainstreaming, women adopt short-term coping strategies that can become maladaptive. Secondly, diversity in race, socioeconomic status, age, ability, so as I say, this intersectionality, they fundamentally shape women's experiences and access to adaptation, and they must be explicitly considered. There are key areas to enhance the literature and the evidence base, and they include gendered benefits of climate-proofed wash infrastructure, gender-sensitive early warning and disaster preparedness, And finally, how adaptation strategies result in negative impacts for women and girls. If we don't understand how lack of gender mainstreaming has these negative impacts, then we won't actually be able to address this through gender mainstreaming. And finally, we really need a concerted emphasis on local water security as well as gender and climate mainstreaming in water and wash, because we believe that this really is critical for achieving systemic and transformative change. I thank you very much and look forward to questions.
Hello, my name is Anna Marotra, and I'm looking forward to talking to you today about wastewater-based epidemiology for resilience in crises. So wastewater-based epidemiology is also known as wastewater surveillance, and it demonstrated promise early in the COVID pandemic as a relatively new public health surveillance tool for confirming trends in clinical data, providing early warning for new outbreaks, and identifying hotspots. And relatively recently has become more of interest for estimating disease prevalence and also evaluating the presence of variants. And I'm just showing you an example on the right-hand side of what some wastewater surveillance data can look like. These are data from the Massachusetts Water Resources Authority in the eastern US. The blue line is the 7-day running average wastewater concentration. It's actually a wastewater load. It's the SARS-CoV-2 virus load in the influent to this treatment plant in million copies per person per day. The COVID case data are shown in orange. This is a running 7-day average for the new reported COVID cases in all of Massachusetts. And the time scale is early March 2020 through the end of July 2021. And you can see clearly that the blue line really does track with the orange line. There are many other examples of wastewater surveillance data out there. But the question really is, what does a wastewater surveillance program look like? And I think of it as encompassing 4 steps. The first is to establish the surveillance approach and objectives. And ideally, this is done in collaboration with a wastewater utility and a public health agency. The second step is simply to collect wastewater. And that can be done from a number of different locations. I'm showing wastewater collection from a manhole here. The third step is to actually do the analysis of the wastewater. This is typically done in a lab and involves pre-treatment and concentration steps that focus on extracting the nucleic acid, that viral RNA from the wastewater, and then a PCR polymerase chain reaction step that quantifies that viral RNA for SARS-CoV-2. And the fourth step is to interpret the data and incorporate them into a public health surveillance system, because it's really important to keep in mind that wastewater surveillance is just one tool in the public health surveillance toolbox, and the wastewater data should always be used in consideration or when considering other public health surveillance data. But it's really important to make those wastewater data actionable, make them timely, reliable, and clear so that you can use them to help inform public health actions. And I'm just showing some examples here of public health actions that we've seen taken as a result of wastewater data supporting other public health surveillance data. So things as simple as notifying staff and students at a school that the viral wastewater signal is concerning, all the way up to restricting public health gatherings. Now, it's possible to implement wastewater surveillance programs at multiple scales. So I'm going to give you examples of 3 scales at which CDM Smith has worked on surveillance programs. The first is the smallest scale, the facility scale. This is nursing homes, long-term care facilities, and schools. And here we worked with the Massachusetts Department of Public Health, the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs, to perform surveillance at about 11 sites, each of which covered 50 to 300 people. At the neighborhood scale, we worked for the Massachusetts Department of Public Health to perform surveillance at about 13 sites, each of which covered 100 to 43,000 people. And then we're still working at the regional scale in southeastern Michigan at about 10 sites that in total cover about 2 million people. This is a program funded by the the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services, and we work closely with local wastewater utilities, including Great Lakes Water Authority, as well as academic partners, the Zagoraraki Lab at Michigan State University, for this program. And in each case, at each scale, we have examples of how the wastewater data have been particularly useful. So I want to share one example from each scale with you today. So on each of these graphs, I am showing the wastewater data in blue. And in particular, these are the SARS-CoV-2 concentrations in wastewater in copies per liter. So it's a little bit different than the units I showed on that first graph. I'm also showing on this graph on the right the case data, the confirmed COVID case data in green. So at the facility scale, it's very common to see non-detectable levels of SARS-CoV-2. At this site, we saw one high and then one very high result. We were able to go talk to the facility management and work with them to figure out that this was actually coming from someone who was positive and was working on a team of contractors doing some renovations to the facility, and in fact was not coming from one of the facility residents or staff members. At the neighborhood scale, when we saw an increase in the virus concentrations at one of the sites, the city opted to distribute masks, a voucher for free COVID tests, and then ultimately prioritize the site for vaccination. And you can see that, once the majority of people at the site were vaccinated, the wastewater concentration went back to baseline. And then at the regional scale, you can see that the wastewater data, the peak in the wastewater data showed up about 4 or so weeks before the peak in the clinical case data. So it gives us a nice sort of indication of where COVID cases are going. I should emphasize that this 4-week heads up is a bit unusual. We don't typically see that in other geographies, but for whatever reason, that's what we're able to see at this regional surveillance program. So we've learned a lot through working on these surveillance programs with our various partners, and some key learnings I want to share with you here are: 1, representative wastewater samples are really important. Ideally, you get 24-hour composites, and it can be challenging to get those samples. 2, methods for quantifying the virus, all that stuff that takes place in the lab, those are not yet standardized. So you just need to be careful when comparing results from different labs or different regions. If wastewater data are going to be used to inform public health action, then those results need to be available within 1 to 2 days. Otherwise, they're not timely enough. Wastewater surveillance will be variable, and so we need to understand how to kind of extract the trend from the noise in the surveillance data. And finally, it's important to remember the scale at which we're collecting the wastewater samples. So, that wastewater sample is going to reflect a certain population, and we think of that population existing in a sewer shed in the collection system, very analogous to a watershed. Here's an example of a sewer shed from one of our sites in eastern Massachusetts. This sewer shed is not going to be anything like a census tract or a zip code or a county or a state or a country. So it sometimes can be hard to reconcile the wastewater data with the COVID case data. And with that, I will thank you for your attention today and look forward to the conversation.
Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Agnes Nérai, Senior Monitoring, Evaluation and Learning Advisor with SIWI. I will talk about inequalities in resilience, drawing experiences from Bangladesh and Uganda. A little bit about our project background. We did assessment in the WASH SDG program. It is implemented in 7 countries by a consortium led by SIMAVI and with the consortium members of WASH Alliance International, Plan International, and SMV. We conducted baseline evaluation in 2018 and then midline evaluation in 2020 and early 2021. The maps on the right side show the two implementation areas that I will focus on, one in Uganda and the other in Bangladesh. On the right side, on the map of Uganda, there are those orange dots. These represent Agago district. This is our intervention area. And then the other map on Bangladesh, those purple and orange areas are Barguna and Shatkhira. This is where we implement our project. During my presentation, I will look at the water services and facilities measured by the GMP ladders, and also the differences and inequalities expressed in wealth quintiles. You can see globally that climate change, social inequalities, and economic and political contexts affect access, availability, and quality of water. The COVID-19 pandemic brought additional challenges to this, which tests society's resilience. We see that improvement of water services is neither straightforward nor linear in these contexts. Resilience of services for operation and maintenance, as well as availability of spare parts, are intertwined and directly influences sustainability of the facilities. We see that people in lower wealth quintiles move both forward to higher service levels, so services are improved, but also backward over a relatively short period of time, in the last 2 years. We observe that services and facilities deteriorate faster in areas with lower income. In Uganda, it was observed that the resilience of water and sanitation facilities are fragile. They are really prompt to weather conditions. Service provision of operation and maintenance is not always readily available, while there is gender bias against women service providers. There is limited accountability and transparency about how the budget planning goes. We saw again inequalities, where women are scarcely represented on WASH forums and community meetings. Hence, one of our program partners, WASO, established the forum, a women association that we call WeWash, which aimed to strengthen gender equality in access to water, sanitation, and hygiene. They do demand creation by engaging local service providers who are women. They promote a safe space for female entrepreneurs to network and share their experiences, and also provide mentorship while building their businesses to sustainable and resilient. In Bangladesh, it is observed that people with minority background often live geographically separated and segregated in areas where access to water and sanitation is challenging and limited. The needs of women and people with disabilities is barely considered in the WASH planning, and representation of women again and ethnic minorities are limited in local public platforms and in decision making. The Making Rights Real approach was initiated by the local partner organizations. to provide technical assistance to stakeholders and local authorities. It combines user-centered materials showing how human rights can inform local action, with a process of constructive engagement between civil society and local government professionals. It's also for structured and strategic advocacy by starting from the communities and local interest groups. They advocate for diverse and inclusive decision-making platforms and open budget planning. In conclusion, I can say that we are aiming for a systemic change in a complex manner. The first is the demand creation with behavior change. Then the second is service provision, both public and private service provision. And the third angle is the governance, with the different forums, committee meetings on local, regional, and national level. We also strengthening replicability by applying good practices in other project countries. For example, the previously mentioned Vivash Association from Uganda is being replicated in Bangladesh by cross-country knowledge exchange. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Corinne, Anna, and Agnes for nice presentations. I can already see there are some questions in the chat box. So please visit the chat box and you may respond to them directly in the chat box. I would like to inform our audience that the presenters, as I said, are here, and also some of the co-researchers with them. So with that, we conclude the presentation, and now equally exciting session we are going to start. It's the panel discussion. We have 4 panelists here. Unfortunately, one of them could not be with us, so we have to play the recording, which was recorded earlier. So what I will do is I will go from one by one to our panelists and ask questions, and also very briefly introduce them. But then for detailed introduction, I think you can go to the files where we have bios of the speakers. And I would like to request our panelists to limit, if possible, their interventions to 5 minutes so that we have some time for questions at the end. So the first panelist we have today is Anton Cartwright, who is economist at African Center for Cities, and his work focuses on application of economics to African urban transition, environmental degradation, and poverty alleviation, and the implications of those issues for the discipline of economics itself. Anton, what I would like to hear from you with these experiences, what do you think about COVID and recurring climate recoveries, and what changes and transformations are needed?
Thank you,
It would be
Arun.
interesting to hear from you. Yeah, please go ahead.
Thank you, Arun, and great to be speaking to the broader audience. And thank you for those excellent presentations. If I scan across all 3 of them in different ways, they described socio-technical systems. But what made them disruptive or innovative was that they put people, and particularly vulnerable people, at the center of those systems, and perhaps paid more attention to the human impact than is often the case in so-called water solutions, particularly historically. I'd like to back up that observation from the presentations with an anecdote of my own, if that's okay, and try and answer your question in the process. And the anecdote comes from a piece of work that we've been busy with in South Africa that flows off the back of droughts mainly, but also some flooding. And the point of departure is one that I think most people in this audience will be very comfortable with, and that is that water catchments are crucial, both in terms of water security and in terms of flood mitigation, and of course, multiple other co-benefits. Most people would recognize that watersheds or water catchments are an essential component of water systems. The difficulty comes, and this was drawn out in Ravi's introduction in his reference to water towers, the difficulty comes in investing in these water catchments. They are in many ways the quintessential sort of public good, and they present the quintessential collective action problem. That land is often owned by multiple different people. The returns that are generated on investment are often non-financial, and those returns are yielded through complex ecosystems and over varying amounts of time. The easy answer as to how to invest them is payment for ecosystem goods and services, PES. That's the answer that people throw at you when you say, what are we going to do about our water catchments? And I'd like to problematize that, particularly in the context of South Africa, for three reasons. The first is that the price of water is often too low to really make a PES investment viable. And that's true not just in resource-poor countries or fiscally poor countries in Africa, but actually globally. The second is that actually, when we look at PES on a global scale, the uptake has been quite low. Yeah. And thirdly, and most importantly, and this speaks to the issues that were raised in the presentations, very often payment for ecosystem goods and services allow people to buy their way to the top of the pecking order, as it were, and so have big distributional and inequality implications. And it's for this reason that South Africa's very progressive water legislation doesn't really accommodate payment for ecosystem services in the classic sense. So what do you do about water catchments? In the study that we've just released, we identify the need for higher water prices. Yes, that's true, particularly on intensive water users, industrial and affluent households. We also focus on the potential to invest in water catchments when you build your water infrastructure, and actually make the point more strongly than that by saying that when you build a water purification plant or a dam, it's borderline grossly negligent not to be investing in the upstream catchment, simply for the sake of the protection of the built infrastructure that you're building. And of course, the third case, which is the sort of longer term plan, is to have water catchments recognized as pieces of ecological infrastructure so that they can access infrastructure finance alongside roads and airports and bridges in the conventional sense. Those are not new arguments, but interestingly in South Africa, and this comes back to the presentations, we've struggled to land that argument over many times, but suddenly in the wake of COVID, we got traction on it, for the very simple reason, and maybe we'd missed this previously, that this approach to ensuring water security also creates the type of work that unemployed people in South Africa can do. And what do I mean by that? That's work that is relatively close to where they stay, no long commutes for migrant labor. It's outdoors, and so relatively safe in the context of COVID. It provides an essential service, which is obviously crucial. Water has become even more essential in the wake of COVID. It's not easily offshored work. There isn't a World Trade Organization agreement or a widget that can displace this work. And so it's sort of in situ. And because of that, it's linked to a sense of place. And we think those are crucial attributes of the type of work that investing in water catchments provides, particularly for some of our most vulnerable people. And as it turned out, the presidency in South Africa got that. And so the Presidential Economic Stimulus Program, a different PES, if you like, the Presidential Economic Stimulus Program, bought into this. And it just revealed to me that sometimes we need multiple hooks to land quite old arguments, and we need to keep pushing at this. But particularly, we need to keep pushing this in ways which keep people at the center of the conversation, and particularly vulnerable people. And I thought that point was very well made in the examples that we heard earlier. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Anton. I think that was a very good example of investing in watersheds and considering watershed as ecological infrastructure. Thank you. We might come back to you later if time permits, but let me now go to the second panelist, who is Sandrine Dixon DeCleve, co-president of Club of Rome, who has 30 plus years of European and international policy business leadership experience. And we had asked her the same question we asked Anton, which changes and transformations are needed? And then also went on and asked, what are you working on, on influencing and or enabling a transformational recovery, trying to get a little bit of her personal experience. So let's hear what she had to say.
What I'm finding at this time during COVID and what we hope will be the post-COVID crisis is this is the moment to tap into human consciousness of what is most essential. And if we don't understand that access to water, access to food, access to healthcare are not the most essential goods and services for our lives and livelihoods, then we've truly missed a trick. As leaders, we must actually work together. And as experts, and I'm currently now working with the scientific community on a project called Earth for All with the Potsdam Institute and others, to truly understand first, what is the narrative that we need to bring forward to people across the globe today to give them hope, but also to make them understand the greatest existential risk that is facing us is this culmination of tipping points that we're seeing between climate, biodiversity loss, and pandemics. That we start to tap into an understanding that we must shift from ego to eco across our systems, that understanding and working within the planetary boundaries, of which, of course, water is key, is fundamental. And then how do we do that structurally? What does that mean in terms of policy shifts? What does that mean in terms of economic frameworks? What does that mean in terms of key system turnarounds? That is what this new project, Earth for All, is all about, and that I'm very excited to be working with so many scientists from Sweden and from across the globe to look at the interrelationship, as we did in the original limits to growth modeling, between population growth, our access to the greatest essentials such as food, inequality versus prosperity, poverty, and clearly the energy, transport, and other systems that are putting such strains on our resources. And so when you have your conversations today, and as we're supposed to be now talking about transformation, it's very important that we understand that transformative change does not happen in a vacuum. And it does not happen by just banking on technology. It happens when we actually connect different systems together and optimize those systems for greater transformation. Because what we need today is not just a transformation in one system, knowing full well that there are feedback loops between all systems, whether it be water, soil, food, or again, transport, energy use, etc. But if we can create greater interconnectivity, both in terms of the actors, so that we put together the radical partnerships that are necessary for change, the technologies that can work better together. I have been honored as co-chair of the Resilience Action Track for the Food System Summit to start to think about not only climate development pathways, but also access to food and hunger. How do we ensure that we decommodify the world's most essentials, that we start to put the right cost on the world's most essentials, but also integrate within our societies the access to the most important aspects of our lives and livelihoods, the healthcare that we need, and as I said, the food and the water, etc. So these are some of the discussions that we've actually had just recently in the Food System Summit. And the understanding even that from a technical perspective, if we optimize the technology that's being used, such as satellite technology, in order to bring forward new weather patterns and understandings of shifts of our soils and of our biodiversity, but also of those weather and meteorological propositions that will be coming forward, that will have an impact actually on farmers' lives and on farmers' productivity, that we bring all of that together so that then farmers and smallholders in particular, and those that are in those systems, indigenous people and also women who are on the front line very often, better understand the impacts of their farming and the impacts of climate change pandemics on their farming. And if we can create those loops, also in the way in which we look at, for example, water, energy, and food, bringing solar energy or small hydro energy that can enable people in order to grow better and not deplete the soil and not deplete the land and not create havoc within our waterways. These are some of the conversations and the deep thinking that we are working on, and I'm sure many of you are as well. So what is the trick now? The trick now is actually threefold. First, we need to understand and address the fact that we are in a planetary emergency. And rather than stick our heads in the sand or continue to react in a similar way, which is to just bank on finance or just bank on technology or just bank on political will, we need to bring all of that together to ensure that we can actually truly move our systems into a very different type of functionality, a functionality that puts people, planet, and prosperity at the heart of any decision making. By declaring an emergency, we can then bring in some of the key areas that we have looked at from a Club of Rome perspective, but also with our partners. How do we shift our energy system? How do we ensure that we bring in regenerative agriculture, but also regenerative economies and circular economies? And how do we bring in the human dimension? How do we make sure that we don't have more yellow vests that are protesting, but actually people are going into the streets demanding a well-being economy? Finally, what I think is most important, which I hope that we can truly work on together as different communities coming together, is to be able to address the key elephant in the room, which is that we have to ensure that we have both bottom-up and top-down structures to shift these systems forward, that we will not be able to do it through the policy shifts that we had been hoping would create that leadership direction, that we have to look at the local level, that we have to look at the different actors in the system, that we have to find ways to communicate scientific evidence and bring it to people so that they actually are emboldened to move forward and not just live in a moment of despair.
Well, thank you, Sandre. Very nice, thoughts. I'll not try to summarize because we are a little bit late in our schedule. So I'll go directly to Gareth Phillips, whom we have heard yesterday also. So I'm not going to introduce you, Gareth. Hope you don't mind. So the question to you is like this: which technologies and solutions have a disruptive but positive potentials? And how could this have systemic impacts? And if you could, answer this in 5 minutes, that would be really wonderful.
Great, thank you very much indeed, and thanks. Good morning, good afternoon to everybody. Very briefly, just let me give a quick plug to some of the work the African Development Bank has done. Last year, we directed our investment program into our rapid COVID response facility. Almost $10 billion of finance was given out to African governments to help them with the immediate need to respond to the COVID issue. But of course, this is a response to the symptoms, and it's not addressing the cause behind COVID and behind climate change. So what do we think we need to do about the cause? Well, actually, I'll go back to what Anton said about the payment for ecosystem services. And we think that, frankly, developed countries, wealthy consumers, corporates we have to ask them to pay towards the costs of adapting to climate change. And the payment for ecosystem services is one subcomponent of that. But the fact is, we have to ask them to pay for more of that. Now, that's not such a wild suggestion. Okay, nobody likes to be asked to be paid, but the fact is, we are doing relatively well at paying for mitigation. There are many systems in place whereby consumers are now paying electricity tariffs that reflect the cost of renewable energy. Or reflect the higher costs of storage and or reflect the costs of emitting greenhouse gases through emissions trading schemes and so on. So, we've done this, or we're doing it for mitigation, and we need to do it for adaptation. So the contribution that we're making towards trying to influence this transformational recovery at the African Development Bank, we're developing this mechanism to transparently, incredibly transfer funding from consumers and wealthy governments to adaptation project developers. And that's the adaptation benefit mechanism that I spoke about yesterday in the keynote. And we're also working to raise awareness amongst developing countries that they need to articulate their adaptation needs in their ADCOMs, their adaptation communications under the Paris Agreement, or in their nationally determined contributions. We need governments to come forward saying that, we need 10,000 communities to have access to potable water supplies by 2030, full stop. And donor governments can then say, okay, we can put funding towards those kinds of activities. So, and then in terms of the technologies, I think, there are many technologies. I'm not going to try to go into them, but I want to highlight that many of these technologies rely obviously on a technology or maybe a widget or knowledge and so on, and finance, but they also need access to land and to biodiversity and to indigenous technical knowledge. And these are valuable things that the recipients, the communities, the households, and the cooperatives, these are valuable things that they can bring to the table. So, I think that's very important to recognize. I think in terms of a solution, we need a long-term sustainable contributions towards the cost of adaptation. And finally, why is this systemic? Well, we know the private sector doesn't invest because they don't make any money or they don't invest if they don't make any money. And again, Anton made that point. So the systemic change is that if you offer a reasonable return, it doesn't need to be an outlandish return, but if you offer a reasonable return to the private sector for an activity, they will invest. That's what they do. They innovate, they come up with cheaper ways, they find ways to do things better and to increase their profits. So if you offer them a revenue stream, the private sector will invest and they will innovate in the process. And that is, I believe that is the systemic impact that we need to have. Let me stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much. I think that these were very good thoughts. Thank you, Gareth. Now I'll turn to the final panelist, Hannah Ben, who is from Pegasus, South Africa. Hannah, pretty much same question to you. Please share some of your experience working on influencing, enabling transformational recovery, and also talk about some of the technological solutions having disruptive potential.
Thanks very much,
and maybe 5 minutes again, because we are a little bit running late.
Sure. I will be quick. Thanks, Arun, and hello, everybody. So to jump straight into it, with the innovative finance team at Pegasus, I work a lot on articulating exactly these costs and benefits or impacts of resilience building projects to funders and investors who seek to invest responsibly. So in the first instance, we assess and communicate potential climate and socioeconomic impact using globally accepted standards and metrics to package these projects in ways that are relevant to investors' own impact goals. And then we also support the design and structuring of financing mechanisms to help our public sector partners access these other forms of capital that help them overcome the funding constraints that usually prevent the implementation and scaling of some of these projects. And I can illustrate this with some of our ongoing work with CRIDIF and the Nature Conservancy on the CORB fund. Is my screen sharing? Can I quickly check?
Yes, Anna.
Great. Okay, so the CORB fund is an impact fund that will finance livelihood and ecosystem resilience building interventions in the Kibango-Okavango River Basin, which spans Angola, Namibia, and Botswana in Africa. And the fund has been registered and the governance structure is now fully capacitated and we're moving towards operationalization. And so what the Corp Fund does is it pools capital from funders and investors who seek to generate a positive impact in the Corp. And the Corp Fund actually generates impact in two ways. So firstly, through its underlying assets that generate its investment income. And then secondly, through the interventions that are financed using that investment income in the basin. This is just a quick slide to demonstrate what those resilience building interventions are. They've been conceptualized to assess the potential impact of the Corp Fund and to attract that impact capital. And they span a range of ecosystem and livelihood supporting activities. So to measure and report on the impact, we've created an impact measurement and management framework. And importantly, this balances the top-down investor lens by aligning with globally accepted and used impact principles and themes and standards, with the Sustainable Development Goals being one of the main drivers around impact themes that investors are interested in. But importantly, our impact measurement and management framework also includes a beneficiary-centric approach for impact data collection, so that we can ensure as the Corp Fund implements its interventions, they are responsive to the needs and the changing context of the basin's residents. And so this is just a quick snapshot of the potential impact of the Corp Fund that we've been able to value and calculate. So what we've done is by identifying the impacts in key categories relating to health, livelihood, ecosystems, and climate of those resilient development interventions and estimating their economic value at the household level, we've been able to articulate what the aggregate potential impact of the Corp Fund will be over and above its financial returns from investment in its underlying assets. And these figures that you see on your screen are the economic value of the impact of the resilience interventions if they're implemented over a 30-year time horizon for the entire basin. And we're in the process of operationalizing the fund and attracting investors based on these impact measures. And so, yeah, watch the space to see how the Corp Fund will perform. To answer, though, Arun, your second question about technologies and solutions, I think
you need to wrap up because we are really, sorry about that.
Sure. All I'm going to say is that I think the rise of impact investing, which is where investments are made with the intention of generating measurable social and environmental impact, is really an encouraging shift for projects focused on resilience building. And so the use of this impact only or impact first capital within blended finance structures is really helping to unlock funding for this kind of work. And by bringing more business and investment minded partners to these kinds of projects, we're increasingly learning how to better design and structure them so that we can access more private capital and ensure financial sustainability for these efforts. So thank you.
And thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, let's see. We have 2 minutes, actually. In 2 minutes, I think the system will automatically close everything. But I can cut down my closing thoughts to a minimum. So just if anybody among the three panelists have any very short pitch that you want to make, very quick, 5-second pitch, you are welcome to do that, any concluding thoughts, and then I'll conclude. Anyone would like to go first? Anton, do you have anything to say?
Nothing burning. I've been looking at the questions in the chat, so I'll try and respond to those, but no, I think.
Okay, the chats, I think you can even answer to them after the sessions have ended. So that should be possible. Gareth?
Well, no, I think, just to highlight how much of an emergency this is, and the fact that, really we have to make some significant changes to the way we live. And, that means that, we need to start paying for things that we have previously considered to be free. Thank you.
Excellent. And Hannah, I'm sorry to cut you short, but if you have any, short pitch this is your chance.
I just think that our investments can create impact alongside financial returns. So when thinking about how to manage your money, think about putting it into impact funds and generating both financial and broader economic, climate, social impact.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, to all of you, the panelists, as well as the presenters. As I said, the chat, I think, will be continuing, so you can answer to any questions that you have not been able to answer. So to conclude, I think, we have had very interesting thoughts. I will not try to highlight them or summarize them, because I will be making a report later on, and we'll put all the thoughts, in there, unfortunately, because of lack of time. What I would like to say, and I connect with what Rabiji earlier mentioned regarding my work in Hindu-Kush Himalayan region. This is an area which is heavily impacted by climate change. The ice is melting, there are a lot of disaster related to climate change here, glacial lake outburst floods, other extreme events, So I think what we have heard today is extremely, extremely important. I was thinking, how this can be made applicable for Hindu-Kush Himalayan region. And I think the audience also probably representing different regions and sub-regions in the world, probably will also thinking of the same way. And I found it really, really, very informative, and a lot of, thoughts coming out of the presentations and the panels, really useful for us for going forward. In terms of adaptation, whether it is funding, whether it is technology, to make it transformational, and also, bring in systemic changes. I think that was very, very rewarding to me. But then I think this is the end of this second session of Seminar 1. But just to remind you, we still have one more, session to go. That's tomorrow. And it will be on disruptive technologies as enabling environment. And this session includes a debate based on case studies and topical breakouts about how we can accelerate movements towards decentralization. And this will be moderated by my colleague, Monica Altamirano from Delta Res. So please do join in for that yet another interesting discussion. But for today, I'll thank all the presenters and panelists for your contribution. And it has been a real big pleasure for me to be a host today and moderate this session. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Arun.
Thank you.